It has become a dirty word, politically speaking anyway, the D word, deficits to be exact. It's been bandied about this federal election campaign, whether to run one, whether not to run one, when they're a bad idea, when they're an acceptable idea. Joining us now for more on the D word, here are Colin Busby, Senior Policy Analyst at the C.D. Howe Institute, and Lisa Phillips, Interim Dean at Lakehead University's Faculty of Law and Professor of Law at Osgoode Hall. And we welcome you both here to TVO. In those chairs, a few days ago, we had, among others, the former Finance Minister of Ontario, Greg Sorbara, who talked about deficits, subject of discussion for tonight. So without further ado, let's hear what he said, and then we'll come back and chat. Roll the clip, please.
The notion balanced budgets are good. Bill Davis was premier for how many years?
14.
14? I don't think he ever had a balanced budget.
Never did.
He was always a little bit in deficit, and he ran a darn good government. Mike Harris was in power for 8 years with Ernie Eves. They often have a deficit. We have a new mantra, though, in Canada, and hopefully it's disappearing, that somehow deficits are by their nature evil. And that's not true.
All right, let's pick up from there. Deficits by their nature are evil. So goes a lot of the mantra today. True?
Well, it is pretty interesting how much significance has become attached to that one line in the budget, the bottom line. And it's very fascinating to see how different parties in this election are, what plays they're making with that political football.
Do you think they're inherently evil, Colin?
Evil's a really strong word. I wouldn't use that word to describe it.
How about bad?
They can be, and they can be bad if you run too many of them for too long. And I think that a lot of the period of time that was being referenced in that clip does refer to a time where there were some concerns and there were some difficulties, you know, particularly relating from 1975 to about the mid-90s, where, you know, the federal government and the provinces more or less consistently ran deficits. And it can lead to issues and it can lead to trouble. Whether or not it's evil, I'm never a good judge of that, but I do think that they can be concerning.
Let's dive a little deeper then on that. There's only one party in this election campaign that is pledging out the gate to run deficits, and that's the Liberal Party of Canada. Conservatives, NDP, Greens, all saying our budgets are going to be balanced. Do you have a good sense of how Justin Trudeau intends to deficit spend?
I hear infrastructure attached to the word deficit, but we have to remember there's another party that's also done deficit spending, and that's the Harper government. And actually, they won a majority government after bringing in a large deficit and pumping a lot of stimulus into the economy after the global financial crisis. So it seems that more than one of the parties might actually see whether a deficit is good or bad as a bit more contextually
Well, they're not saying that anymore, right? They're saying going forward they're going to balance, and they went into deficit in part because of the Great Recession and in part because it was a minority government and the opposition parties told them they had to. But times have changed. They've got religion now and it's balanced going forward. Fair enough?
Well, that generally is when we see balanced budget laws introduced, is when a government has or is about to balance its budget. It seems like a very good idea to say that that would always have to happen in the future then. But what we know from history is also that situations change. The economy changes, it's very volatile, and what seems like a good idea now might be an unwelcome set of handcuffs a few years from now when the economy changes again.
Colin, if it's okay to go into deficit, what is it okay to go into deficit spending that money on?
That's a good question. I mean,
that's why I asked it.
I think that, you know, deficits and running deficits is more an issue of timing. It's more an issue of timing and what we generally call the economic cycle. So when the economy craters, when there are real issues and real concerns regarding the confidence in the general economy, particularly among businesses and consumers, then I think that there's an appropriate role for a government to play in taking on a deficit as just a way of simply alleviating concerns. Now, there's a lot of questions surrounding the effectiveness of deficit spending and fiscal deficits depending on where it's spent, you know, and the effectiveness along those lines. But in general, I think that there are times where any government can run a deficit and it's a tolerable thing. But if you're going to do it, I think that, you know, having an appropriate medium-term target to get out of it is also a very credible fiscal policy stance.
I want to ask the law prof a legal question here, which is the Harper government, of course, has brought in a Federal Balanced Budget Act, essentially trying to make deficits illegal. What do you think of the advisability of those kinds of laws?
Yeah, I have a clear view on that. My view is that you really can't legislate your way to good fiscal policy. And there has been a lot of experimentation with balanced budget laws at the provincial level in Canada, and I think that they've been found wanting. You know, they're quite seductive in terms of people wanting to guarantee some security around fiscal responsibility. And yet, I think what history has shown is they're quite counterproductive, in the sense that they do constrain governments to a set of circumstances that might have made sense at one time, but then, you know, really doesn't keep up with the way things change very quickly. And you have governments then trying to make fiscal policy to show that they have compliance with the balanced budget law, as opposed to thinking about, well, what does the economy really need at this point? And there's also a real risk of people wanting to fudge the books to make it look as though the budget is balanced.
That never happens, does it?
It has happened,
They
unfortunately. Sadly, it has happened.
What do you think of the advisability of sort of passing a law saying, unless it's wartime or unless it's a Great Recession or Depression, no deficits ever?
Well, I mean, I think that Lisa appropriately pinpoints some of the downsides of having a balanced budget law, and I think that the biggest issue is with respect to credibility over the business cycle and over an economic cycle, and while, you know, there's some mixed evidence on their successfulness when times are good, when the economy is growing, and the ability to help communicate a very simple and understandable message surrounding what would be a certain amount of fiscal credibility that a government's looking for. The challenge is that, you know, when a hard time hits and when there is a shock, the ability to adhere to those plans is more or less infeasible. So that's a concern, is whether or not you're going to have the flexibility you need within those rules.
Let me circle back to an answer you gave a while ago, talking about the middle 70s and right up actually through the middle 80s as well, when deficits were really a way of life in Canada and in many of the provinces as well. Sheldon, I'm on the middle of chapter 2 here. Do you want to bring up this graphic on sort of Canada's history of deficits and surpluses? All that red ink, as you can see, much of it happened. I guess it started to get concerning when Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father, was the Prime Minister of the country, but it continued, of course, through the Brian Mulroney years, and then eventually got up, even though it's blue here, into the black in Paul Martin's time when he was Finance Minister. And then, of course, came the Stephen Harper years of the Great Recession, and we went back into significant deficit. Let's go to you first on this, Colin. Why did the country feel it was okay for that great swath of sort of 1960s until 1995 or 6 or 7, think it was okay to run deficits all the time and they never worried about balancing the budget?
Right. Well, I think a big part of the issue was that they got away with doing it for a certain amount of time because interest costs were reasonably low on their debt, and so it was much easier for them to cope with paying the interest on that debt during that period of time. But when interest rates started to turn, that's where you saw significant changes in attitude. And you know, roughly in 1975, interest charges made up about 11% of all federal government spending. But by 1994, 1995, they made up about 40% of all federal government spending. So when it starts to grow in that sort of enormity and magnitude, it starts to squeeze out your ability to fund other programs and to finance other programs. And then, you know, add on to that all this external pressure that took place, both outside Canada and the shaming, really, of Canada as our fiscal position, putting us akin to Italy, Greece, and Belgium at the time. And, you know, all the factors sort of started to come into place for us to do something about it.
Lisa, let me make sure I get this. You know, when interest rates are still very low, as they were back then, as they are today, not so evil to go into deficit, but late 1970s, early 1980s, interest rates get up to double digits, 20, 21, 22, 23%. Then it's evil to run a deficit. Am I hearing that correctly?
A lot of experts seem to be saying right now the conditions are ripe for some spending on longer-term investments.
Today?
Yes, today, because interest rates are low and because our debt-to-GDP ratio is really under good control. And it's interesting that even with that fairly lengthy history of sometimes quite deep deficits, we still have this very healthy debt-to-GDP ratio, suggesting that as long as the economy keeps up and grows faster than the debt is growing, that it's not just the annual deficit figures we should worry about, but actually how that's impacting the economy and whether it's keeping up.
You buy that as well?
Well, I mean, the debt to GDP ratio. So, I mean, as economists, you know, as credit rating agencies, you're much more concerned with the debt to GDP ratio than you are necessarily a deficit to GDP ratio,
Should we bring that up? Go ahead, Sheldon, you got it ready? Let's bring it up. There it is right there. There's the G7 countries' net debt to GDP ratios. That's for this year. Look at us. I mean, compared to everybody else, we seem to be doing fine. So does that suggest that we can run deficits right now and it's not a big issue?
Once again, that's a good way of doing it. But look, I mean, what's the challenge here? So the challenge is well, what is the right net debt to GDP ratio? And that's the challenge when using the net debt to GDP ratio as the basis for fiscal financing, as the basis going forward. Is it's not just a very hard to determine ratio, but it's also very hard to communicate and explain it and explain what it means.
I don't know, that graph looked pretty easy to understand.
But
we're a small bar graph on the right, and everybody else is a huge bar graph on the left.
Right. So I mean, but let's put it in the context of Canada then, and Canada as a country. So and I think that the issues in Canada when it comes to deficits and deficit spending have to do more with the level of government. So I mean, that's the federal government's net debt to GDP ratio. It looks reasonably good. It's much more concerning at the provincial level, and the level of deficit spending is much more concerning at a provincial level. So I think the real question is what government should necessarily be incurring that debt, and what government should be taking on that debt as a way of going forward.
Now that's an important distinction, Lisa, because I keep hearing this over the last several weeks, is that the Ontario Liberal government is running the largest debt and deficit of any subnational, not national, but subnational, provincial, state, whatever, jurisdiction anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. That's concerning, presumably, isn't it?
Well, whether it's concerning or to what degree it's concerning, part of the roots of it are changes to the fiscal structure of the country that were made in the mid-1990s and some fairly significant cuts to transfer payments from the federal level to the provincial level. And so one thing a federal government may choose to do with some deficit spending or some investment is actually to help the provinces with some of their infrastructure deficit and to right that balance to some extent.
My response would be that they did cut transfer payments in the mid-90s, and a lot of it has grown and been restored and increased quite significantly since then. I think the more appropriate question that as it relates to the balanced budget discussion is what's nice about having a federal government that's in a budget balanced position is that the upward pressure on taxes technically is less than it would otherwise be. And I think there's a real need here in the longer run for provinces to come in and to take up some of the tax space that the federal government's abandoned.
What does that mean, take up the tax space?
Well, I mean, take for instance, since 2007, 2000, and I think the latest announcement was 2008. I mean, the GST's been reduced by 2 percentage points, and I think that there's an imperative, rather than having the federal government finance provincial level infrastructure projects, rather than having the federal government finance a lot of operational spending at the provincial level, for the provinces to come in and take some of that space.
Which provincial politician is going to be brave enough to go to the polls and say, I'm running on a tax increase of the tax you see every second of every day and hate the most? Mm-hmm. Who's going to do that?
Well, no, it's a big challenge politically for sure, but I think Colin makes an excellent point that when we talk about, where does the deficit come from or where does budget balance come from, it's not just the spending side, it's the tax side. And we've had repeated rounds of tax cuts in the country since around 2000 when the Chrétien-Martin governments started to run up larger surpluses. We've had income tax, corporate tax, personal and corporate income tax, as well as the GST cut, as well as a whole host of smaller tax expenditures, boutique tax cuts that are targeted at certain groups that have eroded the tax base. And these often reduce provincial taxes as well as federal taxes. So I would agree that that's the missing piece of the puzzle now. If we could gain some revenue capacity on that side, it would be a lot easier to balance budgets.
Do you think, Colin, that the tax that Canadians now pay is, by historical measurements, less than customary, and therefore that is part of the reason why our deficits are where they are, particularly in the province of Ontario?
Well, from my understanding that the overall share of the economy that we pay in taxes is reasonably similar to what it was in the mid-70s and is quite a bit below what it was in the mid-90s when we were fighting a fiscal crisis. Now, determining what the right share should be is probably not my area of expertise. But I do know, though, that at the provincial level, there's a significant amount of commitments to public programs that have age elements to them, and they're very sensitive to the aging and growing economy. I'm talking about healthcare in particular, and those are things that the provinces are going to have to find ways to help fund going forward. And the notion that somehow we can continue to do things the way we have, and in fairness, that the growth on healthcare spending is starting to slow quite significantly. But should we fall back to historical rates, there'll be no way at all of financing it without any type of tax increase at the provincial level.
In which case, let's come full circle here. Sheldon, let's bring up our last graphic. This is the graphic number 2, the spending graphic. And here we go. During the Great Recession, the Conservative government, encouraged, I should say, by the opposition parties in a minority parliament, primed the pump. They went and spent. They went deeply into deficit. I think the biggest deficit at one point was $56 billion in order to protect people from the ravages of the Great Recession. As we consider a balanced budget, which is what the Conservative government tells us things are at today, in your view, Lisa, did the Conservatives have any alternative other than to do that, to go deeply into deficit at that time?
I don't think they had an alternative. They actually did, you might recall, attempt to come in with a budget that did not have stimulus spending in it. They were about to lose a vote of confidence in Parliament, and they prorogued Parliament and came back with the deficit package. They were under pressure not just from opposition parties, from the general public, but also from the international community, which was very much trying to rally itself and have governments in concert bring in stimulus spending to prevent a kind of domino effect around the world of spiraling recession. So I don't think they had any choice, and I think the fact that they were re-elected with a majority government shortly after that shows that the Canadian public accepts that.
That is a good point. You know, that you got to believe this Prime Minister, more than almost any other one in history, did not want to run a deficit because it was sort of against his ideological grain, and yet he did a very sizable one year after year, and he won a majority government afterwards. What do you think that says about Canadians' views on deficit spending?
I mean, the 2008-2009 recession was a pretty scary one, and it was a one that I think it ran deep. It ran to the roots of confidence and fears that a lot of people had. I mean, anytime you see a financial crisis, I mean, it's been historically demonstrated that those are the kind of economic cycles where not only are they deeper and often worldwide, but the recoveries from them are a lot slower as well. So I think that there was an imperative on the government to do it, and you know, Lisa appropriately described the circumstances that it took place in. But you know, I think that it was perfectly acceptable, and I think that the commitment to getting to a budget balance in the medium term, though, which I think a lot of provinces also did around that same time, was an appropriate response to that as well. And I think that I don't think that that's lost on people, but I do think that, you know, especially in the context of this current election, that it's amazing how much the experience of the mid-90s sort of does play on the minds of Canadians, and the popularity of balancing a budget has, in spite of how hard it was in terms of the short-term pains that we went through in the mid-1990s. I mean, almost all the governments that were effective in doing so got a dramatic and significant re-election with a majority government. So, you know, you have to wonder if politicians this time around are hoping on a similar outcome.
And I know Kathleen Wynne ran on deficit spending last time in the last Ontario election, and she also won a majority government. Food for thought. No intellectual deficits at this table, just surpluses all the way, thanks to Lisa Phillips, the Interim Dean of Law, Lakehead University, and Osgoode Hall, Colin Busby, Senior Policy Analyst, C.D. Howe Institute. Thanks, you two.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.